Last week, we began this series, Destination Unknown, talking about Abraham. Abraham, the man who stepped into the unknown just because God said go. We talked about how faith can ask us to move before we have all the answers, about how faith can disrupt the comfort that we have constructed, and about how faith can teach us to wait with hope when things take longer than we'd like. Today, we're going to turn to another story, a story about where the people of God stand on the edge of a promise, but fear holds them back. It's a story about the tension between faith and facts and fear. It's a story about how what we see and what we listen to can shape what we believe. And it's about how sometimes you and I choose what's familiar, even when it isn't good, simply because it feels safer than the unknown. Now, a quick Bible recap is in order to explain how we get here. Abraham said yes to God's call to go to a land he did not know. He was trusting in God's promise that his descendants would become a great nation and would occupy that new land. Isaac, Abraham's son, inherited that promise. Isaac's son, Jacob, had 12 boys, one of whom was Joseph. You with me so far? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Now, Joseph wound up in Egypt because his jealous brothers sold him into slavery. Joseph was his father's favorite son. Everybody knew it, and all the other brothers hated him for it. Now, don't feel too bad for Joseph winding up as a slave. The original plan was to kill him. Come on, that's a little bit funny. But Joseph unexpectedly became a person of power and influence in the Egyptian government, and God used Joseph in that position to preserve Abraham's descendants, his entire family, during a time of famine. Over the next 400 plus years, that family grew into a nation. But time passed, kings changed, and eventually the children of promise, the children of Abraham, became slaves in poverty, under oppression, under a ruler who didn't know Joseph and didn't care about Joseph's God. That brings us to Moses. God chose Moses as his agent to deliver the people out of slavery in Egypt and to lead them back to the land that God had promised to Abraham. And through a series of miracles, Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt and through a wilderness journey towards freedom. And now, in the scripture we've read today, that journey is almost over. They stand at the edge of the promise, right at the border, close enough to taste it. All they have to do is step forward in faith and trust that the God who has brought them this far will finish what he started. But just because you're standing on the edge of a promise doesn't mean that you're ready to step into it. What happens next is not what we would expect from people who have seen God part the sea, rain down provisions literally from heaven, and defeat their enemies. What happens next is hesitation, doubt, fear. Instead of stepping forward, they freeze in place. And what began as a story of bold and incredible deliverance turns into a tale of retreat. As the people of Israel approached the land of Canaan, God told Moses, send out scouts to explore the land they had been walking toward, the land they'd been waiting for, the land that God had promised. And after 40 days, those scouts returned with good news. The land that God was leading them to was, in fact, a good land. It was fertile. It was an abundant place full of possibility. And they brought proof, a cluster of grapes that was so big it had to be carried on a pole between two men. It was exactly what God had promised. But you know, friends, sometimes where there's good news, there's bad news. The people who lived there were strong. Their cities were large and fortified, and moving into that land, claiming God's promise, was not going to be so easy. At this point, the scouts, they're just reporting the facts. The land was everything said that God said it would be. It was a place where the people could thrive, but the land was also occupied, and the current residents were not going to just hand over the keys. Moving forward, was going to mean picking a fight. So what do you do when both the good news and the bad news are true? God was right. The land was good. The opportunity was real, but so was the danger. The obstacles were undeniable. It was a real dilemma. The scouting report wasn't deceptive. The facts were the facts. The land was good. The challenges were legit. So what do you do when the good news and the bad news are both true? One of the scouts named Caleb stepped up into that moment with this note of optimism. His voice was calm and positive and full of faith. He said, "Come on, we can do this. We're more than able. Let's go. God brought us this far. We've got this." But most of the other scouts had a different take. They flatly rejected Caleb's optimism. No way. We can't win. They're stronger. They're bigger. They're better. And then came such a critical shift in the story. Pay attention to this. What happened? The negative spies, the doubting scouts, they started a rumor. That's when you know things are going sideways. When the conversation shifts from the spotlight to the shadows. When people stop talking to each other and they start whispering about each other. That's what rumors do. They muddy the truth. They stir up confusion. They throw everyone into a tailspin. Here's what the rumor said. The land is some kind of monster that eats people. Really? The people aren't just strong, they're now gigantic. And my favorite part, we saw ourselves as grasshoppers. And that's how we appeared to them. We felt like insects next to those people, and that's what they thought of us too. Now, that's a little bit honest. They felt like insects. I get it. Sometimes when you're staring at a giant, you can feel kind of small. But how on earth did they know what the Canaanites thought? I'm very skeptical that they even bothered to ask. But that was fear talking. And it wasn't just fear, it was runaway fear. It was irrational fear. Fear like that projects. Fear like that exaggerates. It twists, it invents, and it's contagious. The fear of the spies captured the ears and the hearts of the crowd, and the people of Israel did not sleep well that night. They cried, they raged all the way until sunrise. You see, the doubters didn't just share facts, they embellished them, and they injected the crowd with an emotional and spiritual virus. Fear spread faster than faith, and defeat was snatched from the grip of victory. As it usually does, fear became anger, and that anger got focused on Moses and Aaron. You know, that's why leaders get paid the big bucks, to be the one that everybody gets mad at. Isn't that right, Jody? It's kind of funny how quickly the crowd turned into blame. Things got really dramatic. If only we had died back there in the desert. Why did God bring us here to kill us? They're going to take our women. They're going to take our kids. It was a 5-alarm freak out. It was quite the tantrum. And then somebody got an idea. Hey guys, what about this? What if we go back to Egypt? I mean, nobody there wants to kill us. We had jobs. We had shelter. I mean, Pharaoh might be kind of mad, but we could just hand Moses over and that'll make things cool, right? Hey, everybody, here's what we're going to do. We're going back. That's right, we're going back to Egypt. Who wants to drive this train? Groupthink, panic, blame, nostalgia. Sounds just like a social media thread during election season. I think it's telling that no one questioned the spies who started the rumors. Nobody asked, nobody investigated, nobody pressed the question, is that really what you saw? The people just believed it. It was instant and irrational panic. But here's the thing, friends, belief wasn't the problem. The people did believe something. They believed it was better to turn back. They believed it was impossible to move forward. Sure, it was going to take faith to move ahead, but it was also going to take faith to go back. They just found it easier to trust bad news from humans than good news from God. They found it easier to embrace the familiar than to face the unknown. That was Egypt's one advantage. It was familiar. They knew what life in Egypt was. They had no idea what life in Canaan might be like. And so they chose predictable misery over uncertain freedom. Because sometimes the pain you know feels safer than a possibility you can't picture. When all was said and done, everyone got what they wanted. Caleb and Joshua, the only two scouts who had the faith to move forward, the only ones who trusted that God's promises were true, only those two ever made it into the promised land. Everyone else, including Moses, died in the desert. As harsh as that may sound to you and to me, in the end, it was what they preferred. Death in the desert rather than life in the promised land. Once again, friends, we see that God honors human freedom even when it costs us. We look to faith thinking that faith might make life easier, but maybe faith doesn't always make life easier. Maybe it leads us right into struggles that stretch us, challenge us, and force us to stare our fear in the face and move forward anyway. And faith really isn't about how we feel, It's about what we do. The problem for the Israelites wasn't that they were afraid, because sometimes fear is the right emotion. You run into an angry bear in the woods, you better feel afraid. The problem was that they didn't trust God in spite of their fear. They didn't do the thing that God had led them all that way to do. So what can this ancient, pretty strange story offer to you and to me in our lives today? First, faithfulness does not necessarily mean fearlessness. The call to trust God doesn't require the absence of anxiety. It requires action in the presence of fear. God is not asking you and me to feel brave. God is inviting us to trust and to put that trust into action, even when we don't feel brave. Now, I think we should be honest. There are sometimes good reasons to be afraid. There really are giants in the land. And your giants may not be my giants, but we all have our giants. We all have those things that we just are afraid to face. We all have monsters under the bed that keep us awake at night. And God does not ask us to pretend that they aren't real. God is inviting us to face them, knowing that we're not alone and knowing that with God we are not powerless. We are not powerless with God. Faithfulness doesn't mean fearlessness. Second, what's familiar isn't always what's faithful. The Israelites wanted to go back to Egypt, not because Egypt was good, but because Egypt was predictable. And you and I do the same thing. We stay stuck in unhealthy patterns, in dead-end situations, and in numbing habits, not because they're life-giving, but because we know them. We know what they are. But following God often means stepping into something unfamiliar and uncomfortable, but better. What's familiar isn't always what's faithful. Third, be careful who you listen to. Are the voices that shape your decisions leading you toward hope and healing and life? Or are they stoking your fear and keeping you angry? If a voice thrives on outrage, or if it gains influence by keeping you afraid, then maybe that's a voice you need to shut out. Fear spreads fast, but faith spreads also when you give it the microphone. So be careful who you listen to. Fourth, God's promises require our participation. The land was promised by God, but the people still had to step into it. You and I are not passive players on a stage, like puppets in God's hands. God has invited us into a holy partnership, co-writing the story of our life with God. The promised land will not fall into our laps. The promised land invites us to move forward even when the way is uncertain and we don't have all the answers. God's promises require our participation. And finally, God will never force you into your own freedom. There's an old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. You can stand on the edge of everything good God wants for you, and you can still turn away. That's the heartbreak of this story. God invites, but God does not coerce. In the book of Revelation, Jesus says, "Behold, I stand at the door and I knock." We have to open the door because he will not barge his way in and force his will upon us. God will never force you into your own freedom. So friends, today, if you find yourself standing at the edge of something God is leading you into, a new direction that you're afraid to begin, a calling that you're terrified to answer, a future you can't yet picture. And remember this, God has set before us life and death, and the choice is ours. May we choose life by choosing trust that we may dwell in the future that God has dreamed for us.